the system in Russia, the Soviet Union, which was a collection of states, an empire, and the system that Mao established in China, and the system that still exists in Korea as a remnant of the Cold War, and systems in Southeast Asia and in Africa, were all predicated on Marxist presuppositions, presuppositions that were utopian in nature and that posited a utopian future where property was held in common and everyone had enough and everyone was called upon to do what they could, right, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, which is a lovely sentiment, and you can imagine how it would be attractive even intellectually, because of course other systems, all other systems, produce vast disparities in income. It's like a natural law. It's actually governed by, you can model it with a distribution called the Pareto distribution, and the Pareto distribution looks like this. It doesn't look like a normal distribution. A lot of you guys have been told about normal distributions and how many things follow on normal distribution, most things, but that's really a limited case. You can understand a Pareto distribution if you've all played Monopoly, I presume. At the beginning, everyone has the same amount of money, will include property, the same amount of wealth. And then what happens as the game progresses, and really as a function of chance, I mean, I know you have to use your head a little bit in Monopoly, but the basic rule is just buy everything you can get your hands on and then trade meanly, something like that. So at the beginning everybody has the same amount, and then as you begin to play, if you had enough players, you would develop a normal distribution, because some people would win relatively consistently and some people would lose relatively consistently, and so the money starts to be distributed in a normal distribution. But the thing about money, and the thing about lots of things, is that zero is involved, and zero is a weird place, because if you're playing a trading game and you hit zero, then you're done. And it's very hard to recover from zero, and you know, it's really hard to recover. You know when you're doomed in Monopoly, you know, you can tell. You've got some resources, but there's going to be some crisis when you land on some hotel and you're going to get wiped out, you know it. So there's a point at which you're headed for zero, even if you have something, you know, and you might be rescued by luck, but you know when you're doomed. So what happens is that as you continue to play Monopoly, more and more people stack up at zero, and fewer people have more and more money, and when the game is over, everyone has nothing except one person, and they have all of it. Now the funny thing about that is that in some sense that's how trading games work, you know. You might wonder why there is inequality in a society, and it's easy to consider that it's because the society is corrupt, and perhaps, you know, societies are somewhat or horribly corrupt. That's the variation. There's no society that's without its criminal element and fixed element. Anyways, trading games tend to produce a Pareto distribution, so that very many people have very little and a tiny minority have a tremendous amount. That's the 1% that you hear about, right? And you know, the thing about that 1% is that that's happened in every society that's ever been studied. It doesn't really matter what the governmental system is, and it certainly happened under the Soviets, that's for sure. And there was a lot of people who had enough zero so they just died. So you know, the utopian dream was completely unimplementable for a variety of very complex reasons. One is that it's very hard to fight against that distribution pattern when people are trading, because mere statistics will do that. And then there's other things that, and I should tell you as well that the Pareto distribution governs a lot of things. So like if you look at books, if I remember properly, last year there was something like 1 million English language books published, and I think 500 of them sold more than 100,000 copies, which is none, right? That's none. And of that 500, you can be sure that one of them was by Stephen King, and he took half the money, because there's like 5 authors in the English language who are on every airport paperback stand, occupying the top rung, and that's massive real estate, right, because it's replicated everywhere. And because they're so prominent, and because they're known names, when people are in a hurry and they just want something to read, they just grab that, and then more money goes to those people. And so, you know, success breeds success, and failure breeds failure, and it's not necessarily linear. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with, and it's hard on societies, because one of the things we do know is that, you know, as you stretch out the inequality, you make men, particularly on the lower end of the distribution, more and more likely to be aggressive. It's sort of like, you imagine every man has a threshold for violence, and status is important to men, not that it's not important to women, but it's a different kind of status. Status is important to men because it's one of the things that makes them marketable as partners to women, so it actually turns out to be quite important to men. The men tend to compete with one another for status, hierarchy position, and in a really unequal society, if you're like a low rung guy, then, and you don't have any opportunity to rise because the society isn't structured so that there's mobility, then the more aggressive guys tend to turn to criminality. And you know, and so you could say there's a threshold for criminality, and the more inequality pressure you put on a particular area, geographic or political area, the more inequality pressure you put on it, the more men slip past that threshold and into criminality. And you know, there's been pretty good studies done of drug gang in Chicago. That was the best one. A sociologist actually went and hung out with a drug gang he got into it. I guess the drug gang leader was, you know, I wouldn't say necessarily narcissistic, but that might be a reasonable way of thinking about it. And he was kind of happy with the idea of maybe being the subject of a book. And so this guy was able to associate with them, got to know them quite well. And then the housing project in which the gang was housed was slated for demolition, and the gang broke up. And he got the books, because they kept books. And what he found was the average street drug dealer, first of all, was employed in another job as well, and was making far less than minimum wage. Now, but the guys, you know, further up the chain, of course, followed the Pareto distribution, and so there was a tiny minority of them who were raking in a tremendous amount of loot, and the guys at the bottom were just waiting around for the possibility that they could rise up the hierarchy. And you know, it's a pretty violent game, so the chances that someone's going to be taken out is pretty high, and then a little slot opens up for some opportunistic second rater, and perhaps he can move up the hierarchy. So the Pareto distribution governs all sorts of other things too. I mentioned it governs the popularity of books, the sales of books, but it also characterizes the distribution of everything that people produce. So if you think of creative production of any sort, artistic production, industrial production, it doesn't matter. Almost everything fails, and a few things succeed beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Apple's a good example of that. You know, I mean, the iPhone, they have their competitors, but it's an extraordinarily dominant product, and they rake in billions of dollars. I don't know if Apple is valued at $1 trillion, but it's close to that, and that's a lot of money. And I think, if I remember correctly, it's something like this. I probably have the figures wrong, but like the top 40 people, the richest 40 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2 billion. Right? Now, you know, it's not like they're stuffing their mattresses with that money, or they have a skyscraper full of cash. That money is out in economy doing whatever money does. So, you know, you can't spend $28 billion. So, and sometimes you can even do some good with it. You know, Bill Gates seems to be doing something reasonable with his money. But the reason I'm telling you this is because one of the things you should know is that this proclivity for inequality is pervasive among the creative products of human beings.